Vampires, one of the most iconic monsters ever conceptualized. Undead parasites, once human, now feasting on human blood to sustain their essence. From Dracula to Vlad to Strahd, it's hard to top the dramatic flair of an evil vampire. But is that the only way? Are they inherently evil, or can a vampire learn to love? Be a good person? Freudian slip. What would a good aligned vampire look like? Have you ever had a player who played a non-evil vampire? If so, leave your stories in the comments below. Are overgrown tapeworms inherently evil? Have you ever had a player who was an overgrown tapeworm that didn't align as evil? An obliged parasite is not inherently evil. It is biologically or magically compelled to live that way and has no other method of sustenance. An omnivore that chooses parasitic lifestyles would be evil. It seems like Angela Hawthorne has been everywhere these days. She has her own front-running spot in the famous Dungeons & Dragons comic, Tales from the Tables. She is front and center in the D&D actual play series, the best available, and if you haven't seen her yet, then you probably don't follow any D&D meme pages or artists because the fan art? Hello? Whew! Now she's snagged yet another spotlight in the first episode of our new series, History of Heroes, where we dive deep into the backstories of the characters that make these stories memorable and worth telling. The ponytail-wearing and evil-smiting goddess whose fight for justice seems to never end started in a humble family home in the City of Splendors. With cinematic narration from our very own FDM and breathtaking illustrations from Doodle Poodle, whose art you really ought to know by now, be immersed in her story like never before. Meet the loving family she grew up with, see the very streets of Waterdeep that she played in, and find out about what harrowing events turned this kindly girl into a fearsome warrior for righteousness, whose dedication brought her to the yawning portal to descend into the dungeon of the Mad Mage. My DM's world has vampires feed off of emotions in addition to as a substitute for blood, and my Damphir is basically a giga-sadist addicted to killing people, because people go through a whole plethora of intense fear and emotions when they're about to die. And this more or less conditioned him from youth to associate the very act of killing with the immediate reward and satisfaction of feeding. He's cognizant of how messed up that is and feels guilt over enjoying it, but resolves to at least use his capacity for violence to better the world, since the land we're in is a massive wasteland infested with marauders, demons, all in need of being killed. He binge drinks coffee whenever there's lots of people around to stave off his immediate blood cravings. Well, it depends on the game. World of Darkness vampires can actually survive just fine off of animal blood, even shit like rats, until they're fairly powerful. But most vampires are narcissists who refuse to countenance to it. A young vampire can absolutely buy a cattle ranch and feed off a bunch of cows. Even if it's less efficient than humans, it's 10 times easier. Cows don't call the cops or scream when you eat them, and 1,000 times less likely to get you murdered. Plus, you don't have to feel bad about being a walking leech. In other settings, there's some mystical element to the blood feeding, like maybe it's life force, or the curse is specifically to drink human blood only, as a punishment. In the latter case, they're obligate parasites and can't help it. Vampires are always evil, and they must feed specifically on the blood of sapient races. I really just despise the concept of the good vampire. It's perfectly fine to portray them as tragic, especially if they were turned against their will, but the process of becoming a vampire inherently strips you of all goodness that you may have possessed. Damphirs, I'm okay with not being evil, but even then, I wouldn't accept a good one, more just neutral. Castlevania Alucard would be the maximum amount of goodness I would tolerate from a Damphir. That is going to depend entirely on your vampire's lore. I personally like the Buffy the Vampire Slayer lore, where vampires are essentially a demonic virus that reanimates corpses into soulless monsters, drawing on their knowledge and experience, all to form their new demonic personality, but fundamentally evil. There's a line in the first episode where Giles warns Willow and Xander about their friend Jesse, who's been turned, and says something like, "Remember, when you see Jesse, that's not your friend. That's the thing that killed your friend." But those sort of vamps work best as enemies. For PC vampires, like in Vampire the Masquerade or VTM, you generally want to go with a more tragic nature, where the vampire is no more evil as a vampire than they were as a human. Except now tortured by an unholy hunger that cannot be embraced with surrendering what it means to be human. Are vampires inherently evil? Yes. A better question is, so what? I don't generally allow my players to play vampires. In D&D, being a vampire alone would be a game-breaking handicap, and being non-evil would make it 5 times worse. That's why there are games like Vampire the Masquerade, VTM, with a setting designed around it, but they don't have concepts like alignment. I generally prefer settings where they aren't inherently evil, but where the vast majority are evil. Anyone who willingly becomes a vampire is clearly evil, and even those who are forced unknowingly become often succumb to their urges and kill or harm to feed their bloodlust. Of course, it depends on the rules of the setting, though. But personally, I think any setting that allows a vampire to completely starve themselves and live, or at least not suffer major debilitating side effects, or alternatively subsist fully off animal blood, misses the whole point of vampires. With a ton of restraint, mental fortitude, willpower, and a strong moral compass, I like allowing the possibility of a vampire who only drinks from blood banks, only takes just enough blood from willing participants, or even only drinks from immoral, aggressive people who they would have killed anyway. But the vast majority should be evil, not because they are vampires, but because of the kinds of people who become vampires and what being a vampire makes you crave. One of the best World of Darkness characters I've ever had in a group was an IRL hippie chick playing an in-game hippie dude who tried as hard as he could to be an all peace and love, but consistently failed frenzy rolls and regularly ended up eating orphans and bake sale moms and all that shit. Now, on top of all of that, he was a Ventru, but had dreadlocks and smelled like patchouli and fertilizer. So not only could he not drink from animals, he was a disgrace to his brethren. The rest of us were champions of the Caramilla, fighting to uphold the masquerade whilst guarding those beneath us from the machinations of our elders, nobly striving to uphold the ideals of our order while resisting its worst parts. Honestly, we thought we were really working for Zimitsi. Sorry if I pronounced that wrong. Meanwhile, Rain, the vegan vampire, was sliding down a hill in a rain of dead children and bong water. Oh my god!
Hey man, Cheech and Chong accept vampires.
They're technically not vampires, but I love the Tokyo Ghoul take on them, where they can't digest normal food, and going too long without feeding will eventually turn them into starving dogs who will eat whoever is in front of them. So they aren't inherently evil, but they are inherently dangerous and parasitic, which means any organized group of them can quickly spiral into, "Who cares about humans? We only need each other." Now, in classic D&D, being a vampire is evil unless you put in some real effort and take great pains to keep the beast under control by staying well-fed so that your instincts don't take over, and only feed off of willing donors. And most vampires default to evil because they are automatically a thrall to another vampire, who probably doesn't subscribe to the lifestyle described above. So, if a player wanted to play a good aligned vampire, then playing them like a recovering addict who has done terrible things in their past and is constantly tempted to relapse into being a classic vampire would be a good start. There's a few things I like to play around with in regards to vamps. One of them is explaining the whole transhuman treachery trope, Namely, how a character goes from fighting vampires or being terrified of them to floating outside a window groaning, "Join us." I usually play around with the vampire's status as undead. They aren't just a person whose body has stopped technically being alive, and yet are still somehow animated. They're a literal corpse given life. And while they have the memories of their human life, there's some vital essence that's essentially made them different from who they are now. Thus, a lot of vamps would see their mortal life and the bonds they formed during it as a separate person. A noble knight who gets turned may fall into the vampire's camp, as he'll work to put their plans in motion. But he might be gentler with his old party, or a fairly ambivalent person, out of a desire to honor the person who once wore this body. A mage or a healer may get clinical. They may see themselves first and foremost as a body. Their personhood or conception of themselves is wrapped up in the physical constraints of their flesh, and so they might isolate themselves from others because they don't believe that making memories or a legacy will let them live on in some form or another. Hell, becoming a vampire could possibly turn a villain into someone more morally gray. They could struggle with their past actions and see rebirth as a chance to become a new person. Vampires are some of the few pure evil races I have in my setting, and they pack a punch. Vampires are social and literal insectoid parasites that dwell in giant castles that conceal their nests. From the outside, the lair of a vampire appears to be like any other Gothic castle. But the inside, well, it's an almost organic maze of tunnels and pits with dank dungeons that house the larvae. An infant vampire takes the form of a gigantic tick with elongated fangs and a spiked abdomen. The vampire infant will latch on to the head and neck of some unfortunate soul, turning them into a mindless servant used for transportation. Eventually, the vampire grows so big that the servant is crushed by the weight and dies. The vampire's abdomen ruptures and releases the actual vampire, a human-mosquito hybrid with a barbed nose that merges with its mouth and drains the blood of its victims. Vampires kidnap young adults primarily and will torture them and mix their blood with red wine to drink. Thus, blood wine allows them to sustain their human appearance and stay youthful. Higher-ranking vampires take forms more akin to kissing bugs for the women and louses for the men. Vampire knights are flea centaurs, body of a giant flea, upper body of a human from the flea's neck. In my game, vampires aren't inherently evil, but they're in a tough spot. They do need to feed on the fresh life essence contained in blood, but not inherently in all blood. And while plants and animals contain some, it's very poor when compared to the strength of a humanoid soul. This makes it hard for those that would try to remain well-intentioned and avoid hurting anyone, as they often slowly succumb to the hunger-induced madness and loop back around to where many vampires start, abusing their superhuman power selfishly. Because of this, people are generally not very welcoming to vampires, if they tolerate their presence at all. Naturally, vampires congregated in their own civilizations, and those with no regard for others ascended to become classic evil aristocrats, as vampires can continually become stronger by consuming life essence, or entire souls, and training their abilities. Consequently, people became more hostile towards the vampires, and vampires were pushed out into these few welcoming circles, which boost violent sentiments. TLDR, not inherently, but finding a good vampire is uncommon due to the generational, historical grievances and natural predatory inclinations, much like AAA game studios. Hey everybody, Brian Von VA checking in after the vid. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, ring that bell. Yeah, you listening in right now, make sure to leave a like, subscribe, and ring. Ring it, go ahead. Ring a ding ding dong that bell. We love you all. See you next time. Bye for now.